Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Tansey from Silver Sands, and welcome to part one of a three-part series webinar in information protection. Today we'll be discussing a one-page introduction to Silver Sands, which I'll run through shortly. Rob will then run you through a introduction and overview to Microsoft Information Protection. He'll talk about some common scenarios that you might have in your environments and walk you through how to understand the data and most importantly, how to protect your data. I'll then run through just a quick accelerator, again, one pager as a start of 10. And then we've held some time at the end for Q&A. So we have an hour in the diary. It might take slightly less than that. And we've held back approximately 10 to 15 minutes at the end for any questions. So I'll now cover just the Silver Sands overview. Okay, so we've been in business 37 years and we are a professional services organisation specialising in Microsoft consultancy and support to the enterprise market. We focus on the following areas, so starting right in the middle where it says people and devices. So we deliver Microsoft approved user adoption and change management to help embed that change within your organisation. The large circle at the top is for Microsoft 365, which comprises of three key components. So first, it's all the Office 365 applications, things like Teams, Exchange, and OneDrive. The second component is your Windows operating system, so Windows 10, Windows 11. And the third component is enterprise mobility and security for managing your endpoints and devices. So moving down to the large circle, the bottom left is the Power Platform, where we've seen a lot of rapid growth for business applications, reporting and dashboards using Power Apps, Power Automate and Power BI. The bottom right, the quite large circle there, so we deliver and manage on-prem infrastructure and cloud infrastructure using Microsoft Azure. So the smaller circles around the edge for identity, governance and security. They're all crucial aspects of a technical implementation to enable a seamless and protected end user experience. And then linking all of those circles together, that white line is our support functions. We provide break fix support, proactive support, all the way through to that Microsoft managed service piece as well. So that Silver Sands in a slide. So I'd now like to welcome Rob White, our senior consultant, to kick off the webinar. Rob, over to you, please.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, I'm Rob. I'm one of the Microsoft 365 consultants at Silver Sands who work within the Microsoft compliance areas. So I'll crack straight on with the webinar. So today, I would like to talk to you about how we can use the features available within the Microsoft Information Protection Framework, which is now called the Microsoft Purview Information Protection Framework, to help you understand, classify and protect the data that you keep within your Microsoft 365 environment. The first question that we should ask is, why do we need to think about implementing a Microsoft Purview Information Protection scheme? Well, it's likely that your organization creates and stores large amounts of data in Microsoft 365. Some of the data that you handle will undoubtedly be considered sensitive, whether that is because it contains information about a person, financial information, or other commercially sensitive information. Now, one of the great benefits of Microsoft 365 is the ability to share and collaborate with persons both inside and outside of the organization in a much easier fashion than you would have historically been able to do when you stored data in your on-premises environment. Because data can be shared more easily, there is a greater scope of data being inappropriately shared with persons who should not have access to it, potentially leading to regulatory issues or organizational embarrassment. The good news is that with Microsoft Purview Information Protection, you have a series of built-in tools available to help you understand, manage, and restrict access to this content. While some of the more advanced features of information protection are only available to those with E5, A5, or add-on licenses, such as the E5 compliance add-on, a highly capable Purview Information Protection implementation can also be achieved with the most popular E3 license. Features that are not available within E3 will be highlighted as we progress through this session. Now, this is not intended to be an exhaustive review of all the features of information protection, but it will include the key features and principles. I will also keep it at quite a high level and will try to focus on what the features can do and how this will impact the end user. We have 2 further sessions planned where we'll look in more detail at what you can achieve with an E3 or E5 license respectively, and it's in these sessions where we'll look at some of the background settings and take a more of a technical deep dive. Before we move on, I would also like to say that implementing a information protection framework can be a complex undertaking, and I hope to give you an insight on how it can be complex and what you need to be considered today. So Microsoft Purview Information Protection Framework consists of 3 key pillars. These are know your data, protect your data, and prevent data loss. Now, as the more eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed, there's a 4th circle on my diagram, and that is govern your data. Whilst Microsoft included it on their framework overview, it is not technically part of an information protection framework, but it does have some impact on managing and handling sensitive information and can also be linked to other parts of the framework. So I've included it here. We will touch on govern your data briefly towards the end of the webinar. So over the next few slides, we will explore each of the 3 main pillars in more detail. So we're going to look at Purview Information Protection through the eyes of one of the users of the fictitious Contoso Corporation, and that's Adele here. As you can hopefully see from the side, one of their users, Adele, has received an email document from a customer that contains some sensitive information, in this case, a credit card number. Now, without any information protection in place, there's no restrictions on Adele sharing the content of this email or document with colleagues inside the business, such as Megan, or discussing the contents over a Teams chat with someone she knows in another organisation, Nesta. Adele has also decided that she would like to work on the content while at home one evening. Instead of using the improved method of remote access, she has decided to email it to her personal Gmail account. So what we see here really is that none of this sharing is intended to be malicious. People are just trying to do their work in what they perceive to be the most efficient way. However, by doing so, they're placing Contoso at risk by sharing personal customer information with Nesta. And while Adele is not intending to share it with other people while at home, Contoso does not control access to Adele's home device or any protections that are configured or lack on it or lack thereof. One further important thing to note is that once Adele has sent the Teams message or the email, Contoso no longer has any control over that document or content, so it could be forwarded on. We will keep returning to this scenario as we discuss how an information protection policy will help Contoso. So the first part of an information protection framework that we will consider is know your data. Before we can consider how we can protect Contoso's data, we need to understand what data exists within the organization. The question that needs to be considered is what information does the organization consider to be sensitive? Sensitive data can encompass multiple types and is dependent on the organization, as different organizations store and process different types of data. And different organizations may also have differing views and requirements on how the same type of data should be handled. But essentially, sensitive information is information that, if accessed by an inappropriate person, which could be someone both inside or outside of the business, will cause harm to the organization or an individual. Now, this data may be sensitive for a number of reasons, such as containing personally identifiable information, financial, legal, or other confidential corporate information. Once we've determined what information you consider to be sensitive, in our Contoso side, we've used the credit card number because that's quite an easy thing to demonstrate, but it doesn't have to be. We can use something called sensitive information types to detect documents, emails, and Teams chats that contain this information. Sensitive information types work using various methods such as pattern matching and some inbuilt Microsoft functions, as well as dictionary and keyword lists. Okay. Now, although this is not a technical webinar, I'm just going to show you this view of the admin console to demonstrate a number of the inbuilt out-of-the-box sensitive information types that Microsoft provide. Okay. So if I quickly filter this list by UK, you will be able to see some common UK-specific information types, such as driving license number, and national insurance number, national health service number. So we can match content that contains this information. For people who have E5 licenses, there are some more advanced bundle sensitive information types available, which can be used to detect more complicated information, such as all physical addresses or all full names. Now, you're not limited to out-of-the-box sensitive information types, and you can create custom sensitive information types from scratch or by copying one of these out-of-the-box types. Custom sensitive information types work by matching what is called a primary element and also matching one or more supporting elements within a certain distance of the primary element to increase confidence of a match. The next way we can match content is by using machine learning. Now, this is an E5 feature called classifiers. Classifiers work by detecting an item based on what it is and not by the elements contained in a document, like you would do with sensitive information types. The classifier learns how to identify a piece of content by looking at hundreds of examples of documents which need to be classified. Again, we'll touch on where you can use classifiers when we look at protecting your data in a few minutes. And again, Microsoft provide a number of out-of-the-box predefined classifiers, or you can also create your own. So return back to the admin console. As classifiers, we can see when it loads that the built-in classifiers, there we go, are available for certain document types. And one example I've got here is agreements. Now, when you use agreements, it is designed to detect content related to legal agreements, statement of works, employment agreements, etc. Now, custom trainable classifiers can be created to detect your own specific types of content. Now, the process to do so is quite involved and requires submitting between 50 and 500 positive examples of completed content for analysis. Once that has been analysed you test it with up to 10,000 example documents, which contain both positive and negative matches, and then you review the results to validate its effectiveness before going live on it. Finally, once you've worked out what data is sensitive and able to detect it using either sensitive information types or trainable classifiers, it is useful for you as an organization to understand where that content is stored. This is where the Content Explorer comes in. The Content Explorer, if I just go to it, allows you to view a snapshot of items in your organization that have been detected to contain sensitive information. Content Explorer can then detect content that's stored in an email, SharePoint, and Teams, with OneDrive being available in preview mode. So when we return to our example here, we can see, and our example with Adele uses a credit card number, we can see here that it's detected there are 54 instances of credit card numbers in this Microsoft 365 tenant. So if we select that, we can see a breakdown of the locations where that content has been detected. And we can see there are 9 instances of that content within SharePoint. So if we go in there, we can see, and then we'll just select the SharePoint site that relates to the Mark 8 project team. It shows here that there's a single file called manufacturing and delivery plan that has detected several instances of credit card numbers. So we click on this link here, we can see how many instances of what it's found and how many instances it's found thereof. Again, if you have the right permissions as well, we can double click on it and we can actually download and open the document from within the Content Explorer to see what that content is. Finally, within the data from within here, you can also get an overview of the most common types of sensitive information contained within your environment. So here we go, we can see the most common type is all full names followed by credit card number. Okay. So how does this relate in our scenario? Well, Contoso has determined that credit card numbers are a sensitive information type, and this environment must be protected. Now, I've saved this letter as a Word document, and so if I go to back into here into the sensitive information types and actually find credit card. Okay. We can submit our sample content for a test. Okay, so I should just do that now. Okay, and there's the content in this letter here. Now, after a few seconds, we can see, well, we should be able to see that it's detected the credit card number. Okay, here it is. So it's detected the credit card number contained within that document. And then you can also see here that it's detected supporting information that reinforces this as being a credit card number. Okay, and that is that console found expiry date. Okay, so that covers knowing what our data is. So once we have built up a picture of our data, we need to start thinking about protecting it. So we do this by building up policies to protect that content. So the fundamental building block of protecting data is by applying what is called a sensitivity label to the content. Now, sensitivity labels allow you to apply actions to documents associated with labels such as encryption, protected marking, and access restrictions. The first step to defining a series of sensitivity So the first step is to define a series of sensitivity labels that will apply to content in your environment. Now, it may be that you already, as an organization, have an established document marking and classification scheme that you can use as the basis for sensitivity labels, or you may not and have to build one from scratch. So designing a sensitivity label strategy for an organization is not necessarily an easy task, as it must be designed for the long term. Imposing sensitivity labeling on your users will have an impact on their day-to-day working behavior, and asking them to frequently change their behavior because you want to change the labeling structure and scheme, it means changing their behavior and working practice to accommodate these changes. It will lead to increased instances of incorrectly labeled documents. So let's look at a labeling scheme. So I'm just going to open a client up. So you can see here I've got a client. So when I open Word in this client, this is a Dell's PC. Can I just go to a blank document? So you can see on the ribbon up here, I have a new icon called sensitivity. Now, if I click the drop down, you can see that there are a number of core sensitivity labels: personal, public, general, confidential, and highly confidential. Please ignore this confidential finance one. This is not part of this demo. So the labels are listed in an order that represents their sensitivity to the organization, with personal being the least sensitive and highly confidential being the most sensitive. Also note that the names associated with the labels clearly indicates that they increase in sensitivity. Now, these core sensitivity labels directly align with Contoso's document classification policy. All content produced by the Contoso organization falls within one of these categories. You'll also notice that some of the more sensitive categories have arrows next to them. These allow access to sub-labels. For example, highly confidential, all employees, confidential, trusted people, confidential, anyone. Now, as previously mentioned, one of the abilities of sensitivity labels is to apply controls to a document. In this example, controls are applied to the sub-level. So for example, if we select general anyone, unrestricted, we can see that a customizable header is automatically applied to the document. If I select confidential, all employees, header changes, and in the background, permissions are applied to the document. Now, talking of permissions, unlike traditional on-premises file share permissions or permissions applied to a SharePoint document library, permissions applied using sensitivity labels are associated with the document and not the location where it is stored. If a document without a sensitivity label is stored in a restricted SharePoint site and I download the document, a copy exists outside that secure site which can be freely shared. When a sensitivity label is applied to a document, the restrictions travel with the document, meaning that even if it is shared externally, the document remains encrypted and cannot be opened by unauthorized persons, in this case, anyone outside of Contoso. It should be noted that these access permissions can be scoped to include or deny people inside the organization as well. For example, you may only want the HR team to access specific HR documents, or you have a new secret project that only members of that project should be able to access, like when I get Project Falcon here. When I select this label, only people who are members of the Project Falcon group can open this document. So let's just see this in action. Let's go back to our slide deck and jump forward to our scenario. So Adele is sending a document to work on at home. So let's see what happens when we apply a sensitivity label to this document and Adele emails it home. Okay, so we'll start a new Word document. And we're going to choose highly confidential all employees, which will restrict it to members of the Contoso team. So I'm just going to put some content in it and save it on the desktop. Okay. So now if I email this to someone outside of the organization, I'm going to email it to a Gmail account which represents Dell's home. Okay, and if I attach the document as a copy and send that off home. Okay, so now if we switch to Gmail, okay, and now I've got one I sent earlier. If I try to, I have to go into the email and then download it. Here it is. When I try to open it, you can see here that it's now asking me to sign in to Word to open the document. So I do so for my Silver Sands account. It thinks about it for a minute. And we get an error on the screen saying that you're not signed into Office from an account that has permission to open this document. Okay, so what this means is that document is not allowed to be opened by anyone outside of Contoso. Now, that's one of many permissions that we can assign. Other permissions include making the document read-only for certain people, or removing the ability to print, the document, etc. There are quite a few that we can choose. So let's go back to our previous slide. One of the things that we must consider is how users apply labels to content. Now, there are two methods: manual, as you've already seen, and an automated approach. Now, a quick note about licensing. Automated labels are only available in E5. E3 organizations must use manual labeling. So if we go to Word and we start a new Word document, and as part of when editing document, the user inserts a credit card number or a few, and I've got some here, and these aren't real numbers, only test numbers. Okay, in here. After a few seconds, a policy tip should appear recommending that the user applies a sensitivity label to protect content within the email. There it is. In this case, it suggests that it makes it highly confidential, all employees. So I can now hit apply sensitivity label, and it's applied to the document, and the header is there. Now, in this demo, the label was suggested. For situations where you are highly confident that sensitive information types will be matched correctly, you can automatically apply a label without any user interaction. Now, let's open another document up. So sometimes a user has selected an incorrect label for a piece of content. I just need to save this first. Okay, so at the moment, I've sometimes we've got an incorrect label attached to content. One of the reasons could be that, well, for example, if we work on a press release, well, in draft form, it might fall into the confidential category, but for its release, we need to change it to public. So if I try and change this label here from confidential all employees to public, seconds, it needs to update here. Give me a second. Well, it should show us. Hang on a second. Bear with me 2 seconds. I'll do it in the web browser. So we've got our going for Word in the web browser here, and here we go. We'll choose a label. Okay, in the web browser, notice you don't see the header. You can see the header by going to print preview. Then the header appears, and when you get the PDF preview of the document, right, won't let it run now. There we go. Right, so if we try and drop this down, what we're expecting to see, here we go, is that the user is required to apply a justification to change it to public. Okay, so the user must, at this point, put justification. So we select the previous label no longer applies, or we select other and provide a justification to do so, and we hit change, and then the document is now classified as public. So any of the sensitive label protections that were applied to it no longer apply. Okay. Also under the protect your data umbrella is the ability to apply Office 365 message encryption to emails. So this can either be done manually through the web or desktop Outlook client, or by applying a sensitivity label to an email, or through a data loss prevention policy. So again, I'll quickly show you this in action. If from our client, I start a new email, and select the highly confidential specific people option, and send it to my internal Gmail group. Okay, and we go to Gmail to see when the email arrives. You can see that the email received by the recipient, again, one I created earlier, has been automatically encrypted. So again, if you have content that needs to be kind of sent externally, and if we're classifying something highly sensitive and it's going to go externally, it's one option to ensure that it's always encrypted when emailed. Obviously, users are still free to, when sending emails, manually apply encryptions to emails themselves. Okay. There are several other aspects of information protection that I don't really have time to fully cover in this short webinar, but I'll be looking at these in more detail in the upcoming E3 and E5 webinars, but I'll briefly touch on two here. Firstly, if you have as E5, you can use the Azure Information Protection Unified Labeling Scanner to discover files that reside on on-premise solutions such as file servers that may contain sensitive information and automatically apply labels to that content. Secondly, information protection can be integrated with Defender for cloud apps to monitor and apply additional controls to files. This includes being able to automatically add a sensitivity label to files that are shared externally, or automatically adding labels to files that have been downloaded on non-corporate devices. Finally, I'd like to touch on one final part of sensitivity labels, and that is sensitivity labels for Microsoft 365 groups. Now, these differ from sensitivity labels that apply to files and emails that we just talked about. A group sensitivity label can be applied to a Microsoft team or modern SharePoint site to control a number of aspects related to that site, such as whether or not guests can be added to the team or if content can be shared from SharePoint with persons outside the organization. And finally, whether users can access SharePoint content from managed devices, meaning that they would not be able to access Teams or SharePoint from their home device. When we think about our Adele scenario around preventing the showing of and access to sensitive information, one of the simplest ways of controlling the content is to ensure that there's no access to the restricted content in the first place. So let's just see this in action. Adele here goes to Teams. Okay. When Adele tries to create a team, we can see here there's a new option available to her, which is called sensitivity. We drop that down. You can see one of 3 labels to choose from, and applying each one of these labels will apply certain permissions to the team. For example, if I choose private group, you can see that it's forcing me to make the team private. If I choose public, it forces it to make it public. Well, we're going to create an internal private group team here. So if we create a team, there we go, and it's created a team with this sensitivity label applied. When that's just finished, okay, So in preparation for this webinar, I've already created a team here that's called Internal Private Team. Okay, and I've got a second one here called External Private Team. Now each one of these has a different label applied to it. So if we look at the External Private Team, and I try and add a person to it, I can try and add a guest to it. You can see it will allow me to add myself as a guest. If I go to the Internal Private Team, I try and add a guest to this team. You'll see it won't find me. And that's because the sensitivity label has stopped guests from being added to this team. Now, if there is some content in this internal private team here, and here's the content, and I go to SharePoint directly to try and share this with an external person, I will change it to specific people and put myself in there. Okay, we can see that we get an error saying that my organization does not allow me to share content with people with these people. And again, that's because the sensitivity label has changed the sharing policy that applies to the SharePoint site link to the team. Now, the last thing I want to show you regarding this is if we think back to our example earlier when Adele wants to work from home. Okay, so Adele uses a desktop in the office, but when she goes home, she wants to use a home PC. So this here represents Adele at home. Adele has logged into Teams, and as you can see here, she can access the Mark 8 project team and files contained within it. I'll find some files and show you. There we go. Okay. Now, but because we applied a sensitivity label to the internal private team, which is a member of here, if we go to this team here, we can see the channel messages. But if we go to files, what we'll see after a short period of time is that access to those files is denied, and that is because the sensitivity label is controlling access to these files from this device, and this device is classed as unmanaged, and we use a conditional access policy to enforce this setting. So what happens if Adele tries to circumnavigate this and go straight to the SharePoint site? If I get the new tab and paste the URL for the SharePoint site in, we can see we're getting access is denied message. So again, that only applies to this team because it has a sensitivity label applied. Other teams, as I said, we can access the files and the content that we need to. We can also be a bit more granular. We don't need to just block access to the files. We can put rules in to prevent download and printing, so allow Adele to access from home, but she has to work within the web browser. Okay. So the final component of the Purview information protection framework is prevent data loss using data loss prevention, or DLP. Now, DLP allows you to create policies that govern, inform, and prevent the sharing of sensitive data. When considering DLP, we need to look at what data is currently shared externally by your users. Are they sharing sensitive information? Is this sharing legitimate? Are there any types of data that should not be shared externally? Now, DLP policies can protect content stored in a number of locations. The E3 license provides DLP for email, SharePoint, and OneDrive, while the E5 license extends this to Teams, chat, and channel messages. Devices, Microsoft Defender for Cloud apps, and on-premises repositories such as file servers. In today's high-level webinar, we'll concentrate on content stored in Microsoft 365. So one of the simplest ways to use DLP is to align it to your sensitivity labels. Blocking content that is marked with an internal label or employees only label from being shared is a simple way of preventing that content from leaving your organization. You can also use DLP to enforce things like email encryption for more sensitive information. DLP can also work in conjunction with the sensitive information types that we have previously talked about. For example, if an email is sent that contains information such as credit card numbers, and it does not have a sensitivity label applied, DLP can block that content from being shared. One of the key things about a good DLP policy is helping to educate your end users on the appropriate sharing of content so that they make the correct decisions when sharing content. For example, there may be a legitimate reason for sharing a piece of sensitive information using email, but providing policy tips to users to inform them, it helps them to consider whether or not that is the most appropriate way to share this information. DLP policies should also be able to inform relevant people, such as the person sharing the content owner, and administrators that content is being shared externally. And in the case of end users, provide appropriate advice. So let's look how DLP impacts our sharing scenario. So Adele is trying to share her sensitive content externally. We've previously seen that we can stop a document from being opened by an unauthorized person by applying a sensitivity label that enforces access control and encryption to the document. However, it may not be appropriate in your environment to do this because of some of the drawbacks when it comes to encryption, or you want to stop the email being received by the user. Or the document has an incorrect label applied, such as public when it should be highly sensitive, or perhaps sensitive information being shared in the body of the email. So, let's do a practical example. Adele is sending an email to an external person. Okay, excuse my typing. Okay, and this email contains a single credit card number. Like that one. And sending it to an external person. Okay. After a short while, a policy tip appears advising the user that the content contains a credit card number and that they should consider that it's okay to share the information before sending. So consider removing the numbers or make sure it's okay that everyone you're sharing with can view them. Once they'll send the email, she'll receive a notification that she has shared potentially sensitive content, with the original email included here as an attachment. Now, if we repeat this with an email that contains multiple credit card numbers, so an external person, and we'll put them all in. After a short while, the policy tip will appear again, and we'll notice that it is changed. Okay. And this time it's asking for a justification before the email can be sent. If Adele does not provide justification, the email will not send, and Adele will get an error to say that the email cannot be sent because it contains sensitive information. With justification applied, which we can do by clicking override here, the email can now be sent. And again, after a short while, an email will be sent to the end user, and an alert will be provided in the admin console. Okay, there we go. So we've got the alert saying we shared content that contains 10 or more credit card numbers. Now, I'll just quickly show you if Adele here goes to a OneDrive to try to share this content. So the same content Adele wants to share externally. That's some documents. Here we go. We can see that the letter we showed earlier that had a credit card number in has a no entry sign next to it. If we hover over it, we can see policy tip here, and that policy tip says the item is protected by a DLP policy. It is blocked, and that's because it contains a credit card number. Okay, so the DLP rule we have here that blocks credit card numbers also applies to OneDrive content, and it would also apply to SharePoint content as well. So that kind of covers this part of it here. So Adele sending documents home. So the last scenario we should consider is what happens is if Adele tries to send a Teams message to an external person that contains sensitive information. Now, unfortunately for E3 users, the ability to apply a DLP policy to a Teams chat and channel message is an E5 feature. Okay, so very briefly, in here, if Adele sends a message to Nesta that contains credit card numbers, I'll just paste them back in again. After a short while, we can see here, although there we go, that the message has been blocked. If we go to Nesta's Teams, who received the message, which is this account here, we can see he's received the message from Adele and it says it's been blocked. Now, like with email, Adele receives a notification email that the content has been blocked here, and it says why. And again, like in this instance, like with email, I've allowed for Adele to override it. At which point, if we go back to Nesta, the message has been received. Okay, so that's how we can use DLP at a very, very high level to control the sharing of sensitive information between two organizations. Okay. So the last thing I want to mention in the last few minutes is this govern your data. And I know not technically part of the information protection framework, I want to talk about it for a couple of minutes. And the reason I want to do this is because in order to limit an organization's exposure to inappropriate data being shared, it has to exist within that organization in the first place. So we're managing the content lifecycle by deleting unnecessary content that contains sensitive information can help with your information protection. For example, you may have a policy of not retaining CVs of potential employees for more than 12 months. These would obviously contain sensitive information about the candidate. Do you know where they are stored and how they are processed? And is someone responsible for manually deleting them after a period of time? Whilst the information still exists in your environment, it provides an opportunity for it to be shared or accessed inappropriately. If it wasn't there, it's hard, you can't share it. So we can use Microsoft Purview Data Lifecycle Management, formerly called Information Governance, to manage that content. Now, some of the features available in Data Lifecycle Management are shown here, and I'll briefly describe them. You can use retention policies to manage the retention of data, both retaining and deleting content based on the location where it is stored, such as a mailbox, OneDrive, or SharePoint site. For example, you can have a policy that deletes all emails older than 3 years. Retention labels can also be used to manage the retention of individual pieces of content. In this example, you could use retention labels to retain individual emails for longer than 3 years. Like with sensitivity labels discussed earlier, they can be linked to sensitive information types and trainable classifiers to automatically apply content. So if it detects that a content contains, I don't know, a CV, a label could be applied to it, saying actually we'll keep that CV for 4 years and then delete it. Labels can also be linked to events that have occurred and can invoke disposition reviews. So an event could be an employee leaving the organization, so then their files would be retained from X number of time from that point. And a disposition review is a process that requires the content is reviewed prior to its deletion to ensure that deletion is valid, or whether you need to extend the retention of that item. And they can be quite complex. They can consist of up to 5 levels of approval before a document is finally deleted. Okay. I hope I've given you an overview of some of the capabilities available in Microsoft Purview Information Protection. Before I end this part of the webinar, I thought it'd be useful to summarize a couple of points that need to be considered if you want to investigate how you would move forward with it and implement a information protection framework. Firstly, I would suggest you attend either one or both of my next sessions where I take a look in more detail at what can be achieved with the E3 and E5 licenses. Secondly, and I need to stress this, implementing an information protection solution is not a simple task. It can take a significant amount of time to get right. I've listed here walk, don't run. What this means is any implementation should be considered in small, manageable chunks. Don't try to implement everything on day one. Slowly introducing new features and capabilities to the organization over time will reduce issues, improve user perception and take up, leading to a more mature compliance solution. What works for one department may not work for another, and this should be taken into account. One approach is to pilot various aspects of information protection within small groups of departments. This will allow you to tweak the solution and resolve issues in small manageable sprints. Next, it is likely in the organization you already have policies in place to manage the storage, processing, and sharing of sensitive information. Any information protection framework should therefore work with and complement existing policies. So one of the first things that you should do is kind of compare where you are and take a maturity assessment. Designing and deploying information protection framework is much more than an IT task. It requires people across all parts of the organization to be engaged in designing the framework, and this would typically include persons involved with data protection, persons involved with legal, end users, as they're the experts on how they interact with data on a daily basis, and a senior person in the organization to sponsor the project. Implementing an information protection framework will have an impact on all the people in the organization, and it is imperative that the importance of compliance is delivered from the top of the organization. And finally, understand what features you're entitled to and consider if you need to step up to E5 compliance to meet your organizational requirements. And so that concludes the main part of my webinar. So I'm going to hand you back over to Mike now.
Thank you very much, Rob. I think that was really useful to run through the Purview information framework. Some great updates, and I really enjoyed the demos there as well. I think everyone can relate to plugging the information gaps and protecting the corporate IP. So very quickly on the screen, you can see here, if you are interested in taking what Rob has demoed and talked about today a little bit further, we do offer an accelerator. It's £3,000, essentially 3-day activity. It's designed to give you an understanding of information protection, its capabilities, and make it a bit more specific to your environment. We'll also run a workshop around passing that knowledge over to you and your teams as well. Remember, it's not just IT, it's the business as well. And finally, we issue a findings and recommendations report, and this will highlight short and long-term wins as well as next steps. So if you are interested in learning more, just tick OK for a follow-up in the survey that I've pasted in the top, and I'll paste again. And we look forward to catch you on the next event also. I'll now hand back to Rob to field any questions. So if anyone's got any questions, please pop them in the chat box. Just whilst we're getting those through, Rob, one question I had was around what file types are supported for sensitivity labels.
Okay, so out of the box, the default Office file types are supported, and that works without any additional software installed on the end user device, and you can use them for the web client. If you install the Azure Information Protection Unified Labeling client on a device, that would allow you to apply labels to different types of files, and labels can be applied to two types of kind of supported files. There are files that are supported for classification only, so you can apply a label.
Yeah.
And that would include things like PDF files, project, publisher, Autodesk files, Photoshop files, etc., image files. And there are those which also enhance that to also include the protections, and that would be things like PDF files can be stepped up to protections. Image files can be as well.
Perfect, thank you. And final question from me, sorry. What license do you need to use these sensitivity labels for the groups element you discussed?
So sensitivity labels for groups is available in E3. However, if you have Office 365 E3, you will also need to have at least one Azure Active Directory Premium 1 license in order to configure them.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you very much, Rob. Just can't see any further questions in the chat, so I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar. Copy will be sent out via OneDrive link following the session, and if you are interested in the follow-up, please just tick in the survey. But yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rob. We'll catch you on the next one.